Good afternoon, everybody, and many thanks for joining the 6th meeting of Tea Time with Bacon, which is dedicated to the Opus Maius and the sciences, and more precisely, today's meeting is dedicated to arithmetic. Before introducing our speaker, just a couple of technical information. First, the session is being recorded, so you might want to switch your camera off if you do not wish to appear in the recording. And second, the presentation will be followed by the usual Q&A period. So if you want to ask a question, I would invite you to use mainly the raise hand button, so I can keep track of the right order of your questions. But I will keep also an eye on the chat in case you prefer to write down your questions or comments. That's it for what concerns the technical information. And now I would like to present today's speaker. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Aurélien Robert, who is Directeur de Recherche at the Laboratoire SPER at the French CNRS. Aurélien Robert is a specialist of the medieval and Renaissance philosophy, and his research and studies are at the intertwine of medieval physics and mathematics, focusing mainly on the history of atomism and the reception of the Epicurus, but also on the medieval theories of knowledge, as well as the links between philosophy and medicine, especially in the context of the late medieval Italy. Aurélien's contributions to our scientific community are countless. I just want to recall a few of them, notably the volume Atomism in Late Medieval Philosophy and Theology, edited by him and Christophe Brillard, and published by Brill. And I also would like to mention his latest book, published only a few months ago, titled Épicure aux Enfers, Hérésie, Athéisme et Hédonisme au Moyen Âge, in which he investigates and retraces the reception of Epicurus, of the character Epicurus within the Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew traditions. Not surprisingly, in the title of this book, the noun atomism is missing. And I say not surprisingly because Aurélien Robert has shown that the very origin of the medieval atomistic conception of matter is rather to be found within the Platonic and the Neo-Pythagorean tradition. And about this, I am personally very much looking forward for another forthcoming book edited by him, Irene Cagliazzo and Konstantinos Marklis, a book that is dedicated to the reception of Pythagoras and Pythagoreanism in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And today, Aurélien Robert will discuss a paper titled Roger Bacon and John Peckham on the Role and Place of Arithmetic. And I do not want to take any more time away from Aurélien's presentation. So Aurélien, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Clelia, for this very kind presentation. And hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. I am very honored, I have to say, to be here and a little impressed because, as you know, I'm not at all a specialist of Roger Bacon, even though I'm fascinated by this author for quite a long time. So when Nicola invited me to participate to these Tea with Bacon sessions, we agreed that I would attempt to shed some light on the Opus Maius from afar, from my own point of view, I would say. That is to say, from authors, texts, and concepts that intersect with my own research, Clelia just very nicely presented. So this is what I will try to do today by looking at the place of arithmetic in Roger Bacon's Opus Maius. And to do this, I have decided to compare his position with another philosopher of the 13th century, John Peckham, and to place these two authors in a wider philosophical and historical context. So to put it in a few words to begin, I would like to show that if they both give a prominent place to mathematics, the place and the role they give to arithmetic is singularly different. Thanks to this comparison, I would like to underline the originality of each of them against the temptation, often strong and at least frequent, to make them the representatives of a single school of thought, that is to say, a Franciscanism, let's say, that would be particularly versed in mathematics. As promised to Nicolas, I have also sought points of contact with my own research topics, and as Clelia just says in our presentation of my work, an important part of my research these last years was dedicated to medieval atomism. That is to say, the various theories that defend the idea that there are indivisible parts within continuous quantities and magnitudes, including bodies. During these years, it became increasingly clear to me that behind this medieval atomism, which often takes the form of a mathematical atomism and not of a physical corpuscularism, there was a singular conception of mathematics, which placed arithmetic at the forefront or at the center of the mathematical sciences, and even by extension, at the art of metaphysics. To put it another way, for many of the medieval atomists I have studied, atoms are considered as geometric points, but are also defined as units in the arithmetical sense of the word, units but with a position in space. As I have already indicated in a number of my works on this topic, the model underlying this particular use of number theory applied to space and bodies is what we can call a neo-Pythagorean arithmetic, which is paradigmatically exemplified in the Middle Ages by Boethius's treatise on arithmetics, the Arithmetica, or the Institutione Arithmetica. This text by Boethius is hardly original, since it is in fact merely a Latin translation of the Arithmetic of Nicomachus of Gerasa, a Greek neo-Pythagorean mathematician of the 2nd century AD. The influence of Pythagoreanism, and to some extent also of Platonism, can be felt on every page of this treatise. Thus, as Boethius reminds us at the beginning of this text, God created the world from mathematical ideas, and first of all from numbers, which for medieval scholars corroborated the famous text of wisdom, God created everything in number, weight, and measure. This probably explains the success of this text in the 12th century in particular, but also beyond the 12th century. And these numbers, which are said to have presided over the creation of the world, would be, according to Boethius, inscribed in material reality, in bodies, that is to say, in the geometric structure of three-dimensional solids. And this is, if you follow Boethius' arithmetic, you have this idea that numbers are in geometrical figures and vice versa. So, the main idea is the following. Bodies would be made up of surfaces of lines and lines of points, which would be nothing but units having a position in space. So to understand numbers in things would therefore mean recognizing that any solid, and therefore any body, can be reduced to units by transitivity, so to speak. And as Boethius says, the indivisible point is nothing but what the Greeks called an atom. And I don't know. Okay, you have the text on the screen with the translation by Macy. And you can see the end of the text. The point is indivisible by nature, and it is what the Greeks call an atom. So making the points, the indivisible point, the origin and component of all geometrical and physical magnitudes, is, according to me, the fundamental principle of what I've proposed to call, for want of a better term, neo-Pythagorean atomism. So as early as the 12th century, but Clélia knows this part of the dossier a lot better than me. So in the 12th century, the first commentators on Aristotle's categories noted the gap between Boethius's commentary on the categories, especially the chapter on quantity, which was very close to Aristotle in a way, and his De Arithmetica, which was much more closer to Platonism and Pythagoreanism. Some of the commentators clearly opted for an atomistic reading of the chapter on quantity, such as William of Champeau or Peter Abelard, for instance, who read the categories through the prism of the Arithmetica. Others preferred to stick to a more, let's say, Aristotelian position, considering points as mere extremities of a line and not as parts of lines and by extension of surfaces and bodies. In short, a debate was born and it became more pronounced in the 13th century with the arrival of translations of Aristotle, and in particular his physics, and of course its Arab commentators, in particular Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, and Averroes. For if, as Aristotle asserts in Book 6 of the Physics, the continuum is infinitely divisible, and if the point is nothing more than the extremity of a line segment, the hypothesis according to which the point, a unit in space, would be at the origin of all geometric and even physical quantities seems to have been destroyed. However, some authors of the 13th century, such as Robert Grosseteste, continue to use the Boethian model and to defend a form of mathematical atomism. And I refer you to Neil Lewis's very nice paper on this topic. You have the reference on the screen. Not only does Grosseteste use Boethius among many of the sources, and I refer you to Cecilia Panti's excellent introduction to an Italian translation of the De Luce, but he constantly bases his analysis of the continuum on an analogy between geometric quantities and numbers. So, as you will have understood, the place and the use that medieval authors make of the Boethian arithmetic model reveal, according to me, certain fundamental options in physics and metaphysics. This is why it seems interesting to me to compare Roger Bacon and John Peckham on this precise issue by situating them within these debates on the possibility of a mathematical atomism inspired by Boethian number theory. Moreover, this approach seems relevant to me from a historical point of view this time, and on a different scale, insofar as the rediscovery of Pythagorean thought during the Renaissance has long been given an important role in the advent of modern science. This was, as you know, one of the major theses defended by Alexandre Koyré against Pierre Duhem, who saw Pierre Duhem in the condemnations of 1277, the real turning point that was to tip science towards modernity. For Koyré, by contrast, the Renaissance made the thought of Plato and Pythagoras accessible, which in turn favored a mathematical approach to physics and metaphysics. In the midst of this never-ending dispute between continuists and discontinuists in history of science, some people wanted to prove both sides right, by looking for the medieval ancestors of scientific modernity, not in the condemnation, which seemed too negative, but in our two Franciscan friars. This was the case, for instance, of Eugenio Garan in a text entitled Franciscanism and the Origins of the Renaissance, in which he tried to clarify the link between the advent of perspective in Italian Renaissance painting and the great treatises on optics written by 13th century authors, from Robert Grosseteste to Roger Bacon and John Peckham, of course. Beyond the science of optics and perspectiva, these thinkers would have transmitted to the Renaissance, according to Garan, a global model of mathematical understanding of the world distantly inspired by Pythagoras and Plato, and which would have consisted of identifying the rational and mathematical structure that presided over the creation of the world, a structure that Renaissance thinkers and artists would have endeavored to revive in their productions. Of course, Garan was not the only one to defend this idea, which was quite popular for a long time. But it seems to me that he goes further than the others. According to him, if the task of the perspectiva is to exhibit the connection between this intelligible and mathematical structure on the one hand and the sensible world on the other, by making visible the geometrical laws that govern our perception of the sensible world, it would depend in its principles not only on geometry, but also on arithmetic. In other words, the Franciscans, as he says, more than other medieval philosophers and theologians, would have adhered to this model, which was close to Plato's Timaeus, Augustine's early treatises, and the Neo-Pythagoreanism of Nicomachus of Gerasa and Boethius. Here is how he summarized this approach, and I quote Garan. Since this artisan God operated in numbers, weights, and measures, it was a matter of conquering these infused reasons everywhere. This is precisely where the link with the Franciscan tradition lies, the study of light and its laws. So, thanks to the study of light, one would arrive not only at geometric laws, but also to those numbers in the quotation of wisdom, those numbers that presided over the creation of the world. But Garan gave only one example illustrating this link between Franciscanism and mathematics in the Renaissance. Luca Pacioli, Leonardo da Vinci's friend, who lived in Venice in the 15th century, and who was indeed both a great mathematician and a Franciscan friar. However, Garan's hypothesis has become all the stronger in recent years as I have been preparing a critical edition of a text written by another Venetian author, this time from the 14th century, Marco Trevizzano's De Macrocosmo. This is the guy in the picture. And we have this is one of the two manuscripts. I have discovered the second manuscripts in Torino, but it's another story. In this text, this quite unknown author, Marco Trevizzano, describes the creation of the world and its composition in mathematical terms, basing his entire analysis on arithmetic and on Boethius, and which makes up the whole of the first book of the De Macrocosmo, allowing him to defend a form of mathematical atomism in the second book. And the rest of the book, there's a treatise on time, and then it's more or less a commentary on the Genesis and Hexameron. More surprisingly, this author was nevertheless a layman, probably a professor of Abacus in Venice, quotes many theologians whose weaknesses he hopes, he says, to correct with his own mathematical knowledge. Curiously enough, he quotes practically only Franciscan authors, which indicates that he was probably educated himself by Franciscans. And among them, as you may have guessed, he quotes Roger Bacon's Opus Maius several times. Here is one of the pieces of the text you have on the screen, where you can see that the name of Bacon is mentioned several times with quotations of his Opus Maius here. So, apart from the intrinsic interest of these quotations, both from a doctrinal and historical point of view, this use of Franciscan authors should make us wonder about Garan's hypothesis. For if Trevizzano quotes Bacon, it is not to defend the existence of atoms, since Bacon himself was fiercely opposed to atomism. But does this arithmetical foundation of atomism have anything to do with the Franciscans? Occam, Duns Scotus, and many other Franciscans were totally opposed to atomism, even if others, such as Walter Chatton or Geraldo Fodo, for instance, ardently defended it. What is certain is that the debate on the continuum was particularly intense among the Franciscans. So, looking, albeit superficially, at the text of the authors cited by Garan, in particular Robert Grosseteste, Roger Bacon, and John Peckham, it appeared to me that these three authors did not share the same vision of mathematics and of the place of arithmetic. Robert Grosseteste clearly defends the existence of indivisibles, thought of as point units, and he seeks to ground this indivisibilism on a comparison with numbers. And for that, he uses, among other sources, Boethius. For his part, Roger Bacon was one of the first opponents to this kind of mathematical atomism, as Cecilia Panti has shown in the paper you have on the screen, Natural Continuity and the Mathematical Proofs Against Indivisibilism. He was one of the first to use these mathematical arguments against atomism taken from Al-Ghazali, and which are from Avicenna. So as for John Peckham, no one has yet taken an interest in his position in these debates, as far as I know, neither on the continuum nor on the place of arithmetic. However, as I will try to show, Peckham also tends to defend some form of neo-Pythagorean arithmetic, and perhaps, it's not very clear, also some form of mathematical atomism. Let us start with Bacon. I'm not going to repeat what has already been said in the previous lectures, notably those of Alexander Fedora and Nikolaus Hegel, about the general idea of a reform of the sciences in the Opus Maius and about the transformations that Roger Bacon made to the older science classifications. Let us simply retain this idea central to Bacon, according to which mathematics is useful and even necessary for the understanding of all the other sciences. Omnis scientia requirit mathematica. And when defending this primacy of mathematics, he first quotes a number of autoritates in the Opus Maius, among which Boethius is one of the most important. Let me quote this passage from the Opus Maius. As regards authority, I so proceed. Boethius says in the second prologue to his arithmetic, if an inquirer lacks the four parts of mathematics, he has very little ability to discover truth. And again, without this theory, no one can have a correct insight into truth. And he says also, I warn the man who spurns this path of knowledge that he cannot philosophize correctly. And again, it is clear that whosoever passes this by has lost the knowledge of all learning. He confirms this by the opinion of all men of weight, saying, among all the men of influence in the past, who have flourished under the leadership of Pythagoras, with a finer mental grasp, it is an evident fact that no one reaches the summit of perfection in philosophical studies unless he examines the noble quality of such wisdom with the help of the so-called quadrivium. So everything is apparently there, including the mention of Pythagoras. All this is therefore very similar in appearance to what one could read as early as the 12th century. However, despite these quotations from Boethius, which only serve to reinforce the general intention of the treatise, his conception of arithmetic is quite different from that found in the De Arithmetica. For Boethius, arithmetic is the primary science, the one that truly provides access to the deepest truth. And in a way, it is arithmetic that grounds the other three sciences of the quadrivium. As several commentators have already pointed out, Roger Bacon, on the contrary, insists very strongly on the importance and primacy of geometry and, of course, of the perspectiva that follows from geometry. And I refer you to the recent paper about Mattia Mantovani, who tackles this question of perspectiva as the first of all natural sciences, and you will find some elements of this story. Moreover, if one finds in the Opus Maius long developments on astronomy, others relatively detailed on music, the chapters on arithmetic are the least developed of all. This can be seen in the very organization of these treatises in the Opus Maius, not only in the Opus Maius, but also in the Communia Mathematica. First, Bacon systematically places arithmetic after geometry in his presentation. And the plan of the past quarter of the Opus Maius shows this quite well. In the second distinction, devoted to the usefulness of mathematics for the res uius mundi, the things of this world, he speaks only of the multiplication of light and of the forces in nature. In the third distinction, he shows that one must no geometry to understand this type of causality and diffusion of light, of course. Distinction 4 applies it to the action of the stars, that is to say, mainly to the field of astronomy. And he takes advantage of it in chapter 9, devoted to the possibility of the contact of two bodies at a point to ruin certain atomistic arguments, not only those of mathematical atomism, but also those of corpuscularists such as Democritus. I mentioned this in passing, that some commentators said that there is a corpuscular tendency in Roger Bacon, but in this passage it is clear that he is opposed not only against to the mathematical atomism, but also to the more physical atomism of Democritus. So there is nothing on arithmetic in this large part of the Opus Maius devoted to the utility of mathematics in physics, or for the things of the natural world. It is only in the following part, devoted to the usefulness of mathematics in divinis, that Bacon devotes a few pages to numbers, only 15 pages in the Latin edition. You have it is a quite long text in Latin, but I will try to summarize this text. It then becomes clear that for him, arithmetic only serves, let's say, to count, and that it allows above all to correct certain errors present in the Bible, or rather in the biblical commentators and in the exegesis. Basically, numbers would make it possible to give precise values to dimensions, distances, or durations when commenting on the Bible or on the commentators of the Bible. From a more symbolic point of view, numbers can possibly be used to illustrate, for instance, the Trinity, thanks to the multiplication of the unit, which remains identical in the number 3, for example. But as you see in this text, you have six reasons for the utility of arithmetic, and the scope of the use we can make of arithmetic is quite, as you see, limited. In my opinion, this restricted place for arithmetic is neither a matter of taste nor a matter of competence. I think that he wants to theoretically limit the place of arithmetic to cut short to the use that had been made of it since the 12th century as a metaphysical tool, notably for mathematical atomism, the theory against which Bacon argued at length in our text. If we turn now to the Communia Mathematica, which were written after the Opus Maius, Roger Bacon takes up many of the elements present in the Opus Maius, but is more precise about arithmetic. For example, after giving a classical description of the quadrivium, quoting Boethius and Cassiodorus, he distinguishes within mathematics a part that concerns what is common to the sciences of the quadrivium, a sort of discourse of method, and a second part that corresponds to the quadrivium itself, but which is subdivided into two subparts, speculative and practical. This is a general distinction that can be used for every science of the quadrivium. So there is a speculative geometry and a practical geometry, and Bacon wrote a speculative geometry, just as there is a speculative arithmetic and a practical arithmetic. And this is the same for music and astronomy. Speculative arithmetic would therefore be concerned with numbers taken absolutely, says Bacon. The principles of this science of numbers, Bacon explains, are to be found in Euclid and Boethius, so that even Jordanus of Nemours, supposedly the leading light of more recent mathematics, is also based on the arithmetic of Boethius. Let me quote this text from the Communia Mathematica. Indeed, although Boethius does not seem to proceed by demonstrations like those used by Jordanus, the power and science of Jordanus's demonstrations derive from Boethius. This is why Boethius's De Arithmetica is excellent and more useful than Jordanus' book, because few numbers have to be demonstrated in the manner used by Jordanus, as will become evident below, and this book therefore contains a great deal of curiosity and superfluous material. So, as you see, according to Bacon, one can engage in speculative arithmetic, but not to the extent of Jordanus. For speculative arithmetic, although it studies numbers independently of their application, aims to give a system of measures of values for magnitudes or proportions, notably for music and astronomy, he says later in the text. It is therefore always oriented towards this practical part. But Bacon goes further, since according to him, the properties of numbers do not immediately describe the properties of the things to which we apply these numbers. For instance, he says, we always give finite numbers to the parts of a continuous quantity, whereas the later, the continuous quantity, is infinitely divisible. And the case of the continuum seems to me quite revealing. On the subject of mathematical atomism, Bacon is very clear. Points are only extremities of lines, he says in the Communia Mathematica. You have the text on the screen. Moreover, the parts of a geometric quantity must be of the same nature as the whole to which they belong. In other words, the point cannot be a part of any continuous quantity or magnitude. Let me read this part of the text. Since the continuum is infinitely divisible, in parts always divisible, the line is not composed of points, but of lines, and surfaces are not composed of indivisibles, nor are bodies of atoms called indivisible bodies or individuals, nor are surfaces composed of lines, nor are bodies of surfaces and lines. But every line is composed of lines, and every surface of surfaces, and every body of bodies. For this reason, when he describes the relationship between numbers, that is discrete quantity, and continuous quantities, is very clear on one point. We must associate numbers with continuous quantities by commodity to make them commensurable, or on the contrary, incommensurable with each other. But this number is made up of units that are chosen by us, either arbitrarily or in any case, according to us and our capacities, especially according to our sensible cognition. There are simple units of measurements, not units that correspond to the ultimate parts of the thing. Let me read this last text from the Communia Mathematica. Since continuous quantities are infinitely divisible, so that we do not find in their nature anything indivisible by which several quantities could have something in common, the continuous quantity considered in itself is not subject to this. I translate it by communication, but it's like to put two things in common, and its opposite. Since, however, we must find quantities which have something in common and are commensurable, and their opposites, in order to be certain of the measurement in things, and for many other reasons, we must therefore equate continuous quantities with numbers. And since these numbers cannot be determined by nature, we shall give them voluntarily and by institution and according to our position. And thus, although there is absolutely no indivisible in continuous quantities, there may be an indivisible according to the senses, and also from our point of view, although this is sensible. So let us summarize these ideas. In the Opus Maius, not only does arithmetic not enjoy a higher prestige than the other mathematical sciences, but its application seems to be confined to biblical exegesis and to relatively restricted themes related to measurement and calculation. In the Communia Mathematica, Bacon says little or nothing about the sacred or theological use of mathematics. In his descriptions, which are more precise than in the Opus Maius, it becomes clearer where the usefulness of arithmetic lies here on earth, measurement and again calculation, and that's all. At any rate, not metaphysics. Even the speculative part of arithmetic is limited to describing and demonstrating the properties of numbers and operation on numbers, without prejudging whether this would be suitable for reality and even for divine ideas. It is on these few points that John Peckham seems to move away from Roger Bacon. to return to a much more Boethian vision of arithmetic. And today, I will approach his thought from a little-known text, the De Numeris Mysticis, which did not have the success of the Perspectiva Communis, but which sheds new light, I think, on his position on the role of mathematics and arithmetics in particular. While it is clear that Peckham's treatises on optics owe much to the work of Roger Bacon, are very similar in some respect, he also takes on some ideas from Robert Grosseteste, whose importance for John Peckham's philosophy of mathematics has probably been underestimated. Like Grosseteste and Bacon, John Peckham shares the thoroughly Boethian idea that mathematics is a sine qua non condition for reaching all truth, created and even uncreated. Like them, he gives Perspectiva a prominent place while subordinating it to geometry and physics. But unlike Roger Bacon, he subordinates geometry to arithmetic in the way Boethius did, and seems to defend a form of, I'm not sure of that point, but it seems to defend a form of mathematical atomism that brings him closer to Robert Grosseteste, De Luce, and notes on the physics. Thus, even if these three authors can be compared on certain aspects, Roger Bacon differs from the other two by his clearly more, let's say, Aristotelian vision of mathematical abstraction and the more restricted role he seems to give to arithmetic. So some words about John Peckham. In his short Tractatus de Perspectiva, which complements his more famous Perspectiva Communis, John Peckham systematically places his thesis on optics in a wider theological context, drawing on numerous scriptural and patristic quotations. You can see, yes, you have this text on the screen. From the very first lines of the treatise, he quotes a passage from Augustine's De Libero Arbitrio, in which it is said that scholars must, philosophers, theologians, must turn away from earthly vileness and ascend to, I quote, number and wisdom. Before recalling that it is through creatures that man must reach God. And again, I quote Peckham, so that through created number, we may ascend to uncreated number, and through created light to the light of uncreated wisdom. So there would be two ways to reach God through mathematics, arithmetic and optics. The text does not say how these two aspects of the ascent to divine realities are articulated, but some clues are present in other texts. For Peckham, as for Bacon, the science of Perspectiva studies the diffusion of light rays through geometry, with the aim of exhibiting the laws that govern our apprehension of the world through the sense of sight. But John Peckham adds, and this is this new text of the Tractatus de Perspectiva, that the Perspectiva studies light rays as both mathematical and natural entities, whereas geometry sticks to the mathematical lines. In other words, geometry is more abstract than the Perspectiva and therefore allows us to come closer to the truth of creation. Would arithmetic be even more abstract and therefore even closer to the creator, as Boethius suggested in the De Arithmetica? It will be remembered that Robert Grosseteste's metaphysics of light, as people used to call it, is supposed to give access to the mathematical laws that govern the creation of the world, which Grosseteste thought of as a multiplication of a point of light in all directions at the beginning of the world. And thus, starting from the created sensible reality, it would be possible to trace back not only to the geometrical structure of the world, as in Plato's Timaeus, but also to its arithmetical structure, that is to say, to the points of light, which were multiplied at the beginning of the world. And these points of light are considered by Grosseteste as units spread out in space in some way. Peckham does not go that far, but he nevertheless comes very close, I think, to this position. Indeed, in a quodlibet devoted to the diffusion of light, John Peckham addresses the question of the relationship between geometry and physics by discussing the Aristotelian thesis of the instantaneousness of the diffusion of light. This is the question 7 of the first quodlibet edited by Delorme and the others in the Quodlibet à Quatuor. So you see the question is, I cannot see on my screen because I see you. Utrum esse luminis sit in continuo fieri aut habeat esse manens. In this question, he argues against Aristotle that light is constantly produced. It is precisely in fieri. But the respondents objects that this thesis would imply a form of atomism. And this is the contra you have on the screen. The object, so that it would imply a form of atomism et ita divisibile ex indivisibilibus, which seems impossible for the objector. In his reply, which is not totally clear, John Peckham seems to accept a part of it, of this atomism, but tries to show that it does not imply that the diffusion of light be discrete, or that motion is composed of indivisibles. To show this, he uses an example that will become standard in 14th century debates on the continuum, that of a sphere rolling on a plane. The contact between the sphere and the tangent surface is a point, but the movement of the sphere on the surface is continuous, and therefore traces a continuous line when rolling, in which one can distinguish the existence of all the points of contact between the sphere and the surface. So motion itself is not discrete or successive, nor is space or the surface on which the sphere is rolled. This is classical in the tradition of medieval atomism to assert that the continuum is composed of indivisibles, or there are indivisibles in the continuum, but is still a continuum. That is, quantities are really continuous and not discrete. So contrary to ancient atomism, like atomism of Epicurus or Democritus, their view of the world is not discrete. There are atomists because there are indivisibles in the world, but still the world is continuous. There is no void for Grosseteste, for instance, or many other atomists in the Middle Ages. In this text, which is not absolutely clear, because he says that motus ille nec tamen componitur motus ille ex indivisibilibus, so he seems to say that he's arguing against atomism, but in fact, this classical example seems to go in the direction of the continuity of the surface, but also the existence of this puncta quetangit, as you can see in the text. So the puncta seems to exist in a way. So applied to the case of light, it can be said that it is continuously generated while being composed of indivisibles point of light, as Robert Grosseteste said in the De Luce, but we have only a few lines, so it's difficult to infer this conclusion in Peckham. But as you will see, the last text I would like to discuss with you is the De Numeris Mysticis, because I think in this text, John Peckham goes even further, saying that numbers exist in some way in real things. And the editor of this text, Barnabas Hughes, has shown in his introduction that the analysis of numbers in De Numeris Mysticis is based on a long textual tradition that stretches from Augustine to Bonaventure via Boethius and Robert Grosseteste. The use of these sources mixes mathematical analysis with symbolic interpretations of numbers in biblical exegesis, so that the treatise is divided into two distinct parts, one dealing with numbers in general, in the manner of a treatise of arithmetic, and the other applying this theory to numerological analysis of scripture. And Barnabas Hughes even proposes to classify the De Numeris Mysticis among the scriptural commentaries of John Peckham, not among his scientific works. And as in the Tractatus de Perspectiva, this theological dimension appears from the very first lines of the text. Let me read the first lines of the De Numeris Mysticis. The Lord Jesus arranged all things in number, measure, and weight, as wisdom says. According to Augustine, he made all things spring from numbers, because he also created everything through unchangeable numbers. Moreover, he transmitted your mysteries in the Holy Scriptures, wrapped in numbers. I will therefore teach about simple numbers what you have taught me of the simple. I'm not sure of the end of the translation. The translation is mine. I did that very quickly yesterday, so feel free to correct my English translations. So let us leave aside the strictly numerological part of the treatise to concentrate on its arithmetical part. In general, as Peckham reminds us, the Sapientes Mundi approach numbers from different points of view. You have the text on the screen. Either as metaphysicians, or as musicians, or as geometers, or as arithmeticians. It should be noted that astronomy has disappeared from this new quadrivium in favor of metaphysics, and that the Perspectiva is not mentioned in this text. Music, he says, deals with numbers in sounds, geometry with the measurement of measurable quantities, but with numbers, and arithmetic with all countable quantities with numbers. As for metaphysics, it tries to explore the essence of numbers in general. In the rest of the text, Peckham sticks essentially to arithmetic, even if he touches in passing on some of the important metaphysical questions related to the mode of being of numbers, for instance. As if the distinction between arithmetic and metaphysics was not so clear-cut after all, contrary to Roger Bacon's position at the beginning of the Communia Mathematica. And on this point, I refer you to Flavia Marcacci and Fabio Sella's recent papers on these issues. You have the references here. Concerning the mode of being of numbers, Peckham's position is very clear. Number is not a mere fiction in the mind, a mere abstraction, a concept, and even less a convention to cut and measure reality, as we have seen in Bacon's text earlier. You have the text on the screen. I'm trying to summarize it. Number also really exists in things. There is therefore a perfect match between the numerus numerans and the numerus numeratus, not simply because one is abstracted from the other, but because these numbers describe the very same reality from two different angles. The numerus numerans refers to what he calls the mathematical body, while the other, the numerus numeratus, refers to the natural body. And these two bodies are in perfect correspondence. So just as the Perspectiva studies geometric entities both as mathematical entities and as natural entities, arithmetics seems to describe both the deep mathematical structure of geometric entities, as in Boethius, but also the deep structure of natural bodies. So if the lines that make up surfaces are composed of indivisibles, of points, which are like units in space, as he seems to accept in the quodlibet quoted earlier, then the number in a natural body would correspond to the number of units that ultimately constitute and structure a three-dimensional solid. And you can see that in this text, Peckham says that about the point, some have asserted that the point which has no part does not exist, etc. And you see, but their error is obvious. And the text ends with this sentence, thus all mathematical things exist in natural things, even the point, even the indivisible point. We thus find in the De Numeris Mysticis the fundamental intuition of what I call the Neo-Pythagorean tradition transmitted by Boethius. Numbers are both in ideas and in things, not by a relation of participation, as in Plato, not in the mode of a simple abstraction, as in Aristotle, but as principles inscribed in the matter of everything. Solids are then really composed of surfaces of lines and lines of points. Because numbers are inscribed in geometrical figures and because these correspond point by point to things in nature, in natural bodies, it can be said that from a metaphysical point of view, numbers are in a way the principles of natural reality, are among, let's say, the principles of natural reality. So I spoke for quite a long time, just two concluding remarks, and I stop here. First of all, I think that these debates at the end of the 13th century, commentators are usually focused on Robert Grosseteste, who is probably the clearer author on these issues in the De Luce. But anyway, we see that what I call Neo-Pythagoreanism is a matter of discussion at this time, even though the reference to Pythagoras is sometimes ambiguous. And you have seen that, for instance, Roger Bacon quotes Boethius with the reference to Pythagoras, but at the end, he does not follow until the end Boethius' theory or the way other people at the time, like Grosseteste, used to read Boethius. Another remark is about Eugenio Garan and his hypothesis of the role of Franciscanism in the Renaissance. In his paper, Garan apparently didn't know the existence of Peckham's De Numeris Mysticis, which would have been a good example for him of what he wanted to show. But we cannot do as he did, putting all these Franciscan authors in the same bag. I think it's our job as historian of philosophy to insist on the differences more than on the similitudes. And this paper, the aim of this paper was to show that there are probably slight differences between the three authors Garan quoted, Grosseteste, Bacon, and Peckham. At least on this point, on arithmetic, I think that Bacon and Peckham did not share the same view about the place and role they wanted to give to arithmetic. So, thank you very much for your attention.